Our last speaker for tonight is Rudd Turnbull, and we realize we're running a little bit late, but stick with us. The reception will be later. You want to stay and hear Rudd. He's a self-described student of the human condition in a disability policy context. He's the co-founder, co-director, and distinguished professor of the Beach Center on Disabilities, also at the University of Kansas. Rudd is a researcher, teacher, consultant, and advocate in the field of developmental disabilities. Rumor has it that Rudd taught a law class while at Illinois years ago. And 2 years ago, Fred Orloff, one of our Illinois PhDs, presented him with the notes from the class that he took in the 70s. I told Rudd I was going to tell this because he was maybe going to tell the same story. And I thought, wow, this guy saved the notes from the 70s. Imagine keeping your class notes, students, from now until 40 years hence. I thought that must have been a very impressive class that you taught. So please join me in welcoming our last speaker at the Kirk Symposium, Rudd Turnbull.
The story has something to do with the fact that Fred wrote that parents need to be serviced. No, they need to be in-serviced. And I said that reminded me something about what bulls and cows do to each other. Moo! I wrote it on there. And apparently Fred never forgot that. I'm sorry that I ever said it. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm conscious of your time. I'm going to give a paean to Jim and to Sam and to Ronnie and the children. I'm going to make a plea to you. I'm going to leave you with a charge, and I'm going to do this by running very quickly through the history and making a few projections for the future, if I know how to work this. What button do I wrote the Assistive Technology Act, and I don't even know how to use this. What button do I use to move on? Say again? The one on the right. Ah, yes. Well, the era of egregiousness. It was very simple. There was nobody going to school anymore. The antidote to it was research. You heard a lot about the research today. It was done by Sam Kirk, it was done by Jim Gallagher, Bernie Farber, Colestor, Merle Carnes, Goldstein. The other aspect, the other antidote were the parents and lawyers. I'm a lapsed lawyer, which is the best kind of lawyer, of course. And we got things started. And what we did, basically, is to rely on Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education, which proclaimed that racial segregation in the school was unconstitutional. What we did is to substitute the word disability for the word they used in the Supreme Court decision, Nero. And if you begin to think about the position of people with disabilities and the position of persons of a different race, one can see that we began to use legal precedent as part of this era of reform. I'm going to move somewhat quickly. In that era of reform, one of the major milestones was the enactment of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, 94-142. And then we got Part C for young children. And then we got the transition. And then we got early childhood education. These two eras, the era of egregiousness was the first era. The era of reform was the second era. And we are now somewhere in the 1990s, and did it say 1990? Well, whatever it said. We're in this era, third era, which is the era of retaining the rights that we've created. And the Americans with Disabilities Act is certainly one of the major milestones there. But we also have, I'm trying to see what I put on the board here. Yes, the Assistive Technology Act. That made a huge difference in the education of children with disabilities. Assistive technology is now a related service. You cannot do an IEP legally without taking into account a child's need for assistive technology. So the third era was one of holding tight but also making advances. We then come to what I call the era of retrenchment, where we begin to realize how sophisticated the disability field has become, how very complex matters are, and we have some ambiguity about this notion of disability to begin with. Baby doe, the child who is born with an obvious anomaly. The question is, do we treat? If we treat, may we withdraw? And if we don't treat, what happens? Well, the child dies. So increasingly, we have used technology to preserve the life of baby doe. And yet there is, if you come down to it, if you think about it, some discomfort, perhaps, with the notion of treatment, of a compelled treatment, legally compelled treatment. And I was the person who wrote the principles of treatment that then became part of the Child Abuse Protection Treatment Act, federal law. We began to question whether our enthusiasm for reform was really well grounded, whether it was sensible, whether we perhaps were doing too much. And it not shows up just at baby doe, it shows up in the entire issue about the use of the Human Genome Project and the whole issue about abortion. These were tough eras. We began to stand back and to ask ourselves some questions. We now move, and I'm going to do this quickly because I'm going to make a few points at the end. We now move into where we are today and what I call a fearsome future. Where are we today in education? We are asking ourselves about the least restrictive environment. Is it an end in itself, or is it a means for an appropriate education? Susan, we were talking about that just this morning. We don't know quite what to do about discipline. The law tells us what to do, but we don't quite know really what to do in the classroom when it comes to discipline matters. We are concerned about measuring what we do. Accountability is a big driver. And the big driver seems to be around academics alone, and that perhaps is correct, but is also insufficient. We begin to ask ourselves about work and where people live. We begin to ask ourselves about how we support the families of children with disabilities. This is the point that Anne is making. It's not just about partnerships, which is an element of support, but what do we do about American families? You know, it's interesting, almost every European country has a policy of family support because the men were killed in the First and Second World Wars, and we needed to rebuild the male population of Europe, and that's the origin of family support in the West. We have a concern in this country about families, particularly those who are racially, ethnically, linguistically, and culturally of a minority population. That is a major concern for us. We have concerns these days about people's behavior. We don't quite understand fully the neurological causes of challenging behavior. And we don't yet quite practice sufficiently and faithfully enough the applied behavior, the behavioral approach with applied behavior analysis and positive behavioral supports and behavior intervention plans and PBS, positive behavior support, and school-wide. We are dealing with the question of self-determination, the autonomy, the legal right of a person with a disability, even the minor child, and especially the parent of the child. Remember Anne's slides? You get too much involved, you're not a good parent. You get too little involved, you're not a good parent. Well, what about the parent's choice to be involved in the first place, and what are they choosing to be involved in? That's a good question, but the idea is we create dependent people when we do too much for them? How do we then create more competent people with disabilities through the whole issue of self-determination? That's a big question for us today. Now, I want to go to the sixth, that was the fifth area. I want to go to the sixth era, which is today and tomorrow. And here are the major drivers of what's going to happen in the disability field. The first is demographics, the shifting of population. The second is, what are we going to do about families? The third has to do with prevention. How seriously do we take this notion of prevention? Not just prenatal, not just perinatal, but postnatal prevention through special education. When Paul is telling us the data is showing that we're doing less for fewer, well, you have to ask yourself, is that a good prevention policy or is it not? We are, of course, concerned with economics. China has passed the United States as the economically most productive country in the United States. The data came out 3 days ago. We're number 2 in a country that's accustomed to being number 1. We have to ask ourselves, how are we spending our money and how well are we getting, how are we spending it and what results are we getting for it? And in a country where the gap is as big as it is and where disability correlates with poverty, racial, ethnic, linguistic, and cultural difference, single-parent family status, and where you live, this theory of comorbidity, we have to ask ourselves whether our economic policies, in fact, are sponsoring disability by neglecting who gets what in this country as a consequence of public and private initiative. We have a huge concern about entitlement policies. Medicare, Medicaid, completely under attack. Our culture is a major driver, and by culture I mean how we represent in our art, and our literature, and our theater, and in movies, how we represent people with disability. And the new 4-letter word is now a much larger word. It's the R word. What are we doing? What are we saying to each other about people whom you have chosen to teach? And that's a huge cultural challenge for us. Technology is a major, major way of supporting people with disabilities. It's also a major way of making sure they aren't born. Our workforce, Paul again, we have talked about the teacher education business. And are we getting the right kinds of teachers? In Illinois, the data Paul shows us says, yes, absolutely, we are. And I, as a lawyer, am concerned about whether we have enough people who really represent people with disabilities. Is there a sufficient legal cadre to work with them? These are the big pictures. Now, I want to take us now, in the few minutes that I have, to this. WWSKJDD. What in the world does that mean? Well, you would have thought that Paul Sendelar and Ann Turnbull wrote my remarks. The difference is they had an S instead of a D at the end. So what does this mean? It means this. What would Sam Kirk, Jim Gallagher do? Not say, do. And here's what they would do, because this is what they've done all the time, and this is what you need to do. You need to study, you need to learn, and then you need to act. Knowledge that is not used is not worth having. Second, you need to be bold. Fortune favors the brave. That's the Turnbull family motto. You need to be brave. You need to be optimistic. These are tough times, but my God, in the middle of the cave, there is a canary. It is better to light a candle than it is to curse the darkness. And we have to be concerned with this thing about dignity. And I want to take us now from this, what would we do? Oh, whoa, I need to go back. Hang on. Yes, there's another WW. And what does this one mean? WWSLBHSFD. Well, you know who these people are. Steve Lilly, former chairman of the department, hired me to come out here and teach for 2 summers in a row. It was a marvelous experience. I'd never been to a university where the centerpiece of the university is a cornfield. I mean, this made me so understanding of how good Kansas and Illinois is. BH, the old colonel himself. I never made it past sergeant. Here's the colonel. What would Bob Henderson do? And what would Susan Fowler do? And here's what they would do. They would learn, study, and act. They would be bold. They would be, because they always have been, optimistic, and they've always carried themselves and comported themselves with dignity. Now, with this notion of what would people do, what would leaders do, here's what I'm going to suggest. That the critical question is how we regard a person with a disability. What is their personhood? Do we attribute to them a certain status? And is that a worthwhile status? Oh, we attribute status, but is it one that is really worth giving? And here's where Anne was, and where she and I have been thinking. Empathy. Empathy is a sense of identification, but that's all it is. It is an inert psychological state, an inert emotional state. I can identify with you. Good, so what? You have to go to compassion. And compassion is empathy in action. So you begin. This is what you all have to do. This is what the schools have to do. You begin to figure out, how do we get empathy into our schools? How do we then act with compassion to people whom we are teaching? How do we attribute to them dignity, which is esteem? And the next question is, how then do we create in our schools an ethical community? A community in which empathy and compassion and dignity combine to have an ethic of goodness, of decency. And if we create in our schools ethical communities, we will begin to create in our communities ethical communities where people will look after each other. And so my plea to you is to dig for dignity. It is a construct that began immediately after the Second World War, when the United Nations adopted its Charter on Human Rights. It has been restated in the United Nations declarations all the way since then, through 2010 and the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities. It is an element of our Supreme Court law. And I've read all these Supreme Court decisions about dignity. And interestingly, it shows up having to do with capital punishment. Hello, Oklahoma. It shows up in how we treat prisoners, solitary confinement. It shows up in the disability world. Judge Frank Johnson, United States District Court, Southern District of Alabama, Middle District of Alabama, 1972, writing in Wyatt versus Stickney, a right to treatment law, he said, the way Alabama has treated people in its institutions denies them of human dignity and violates the Constitution. Two different constructs coming to bear here. in 2001, I read every statute Congress had ever enacted about disability, every one that's on the books. I read every decision of the United States Supreme Court having to do with disability of any kind. And I learned that there are three constitutional precepts: life, liberty, and equality. Sounds like the French Revolution. But then I said, the law isn't doing a good enough job of expressing what we are really all about in our business. And so I began to think, what is really going on in Congress? What's going on in the Supreme Court? And what's going on is that there is an ethical construct that is brought to bear. And the ethical construct is, it's the family first, because the family is the ultimate and initial social unit. And if we don't take care of our families, family support, Ann's work on partnership, we are not going to have an ethical community and an ethical way of dealing with each other. The second is, it's self-dignity. How are we treating people with respect? And the third is, once you treat people with respect and dignity, then you create an ethical community. And in this ethical community, less able does not mean less worthy. It means that we have respect for our fellow individual. It means that a person with a disability is inherently worthy, not because they do something, not because they're instrumental value to us, but because of their inherent status as a person. And we have changed the word mental retardation to be intellectual disability. That dignifies. And so I want to suggest to you on the WWD theme that what would WWYD, what would you do? What would you do? My paean has been to Jim and Sam. My memory is of Jay. My best teacher has been my son. And my charge to you is very straightforward. Begin the Dignity Project at the University of Illinois. I'm retiring from the University of Kansas. I can't assemble a project staff to study dignity. I am not a teacher in the schools. I cannot figure out how I can convert my classroom to be an ethical community based on dignity. The challenge that I wish to leave with you is this. It is that you will undertake individually, WWYD, and collectively, the Illinois Dignity Project. And my second suggestion, my second charge to you is this. When it comes time for Congress to reauthorize the Individuals with Disabilities Act, rename it. And here's what I would call it: the Individualized Dignifying Education Act. Thank you very much.